I mentioned earlier my class fellow and one of my closest friends, a Hindu boy called Satyantar Kumar, whose family was one of the old Hindu families of Lahore, and they lived in Anarkali in a house above their shop. Now, I left for England in February 1965, and the September 1965 war took place while I was there. Ironically, I watched it on television with Indian friends, and we were both looking sheepishly at each other when we saw the pictures from back home. Now, a rather tragic incident happened with my friend Satyantar Kumar and his family. When the war broke out, a mob arrived at their shop and house, threatening to burn them out. And it is a measure, I think, of humanity that transcends these divisions, that it was their neighbors and friends who confronted the mob and dispelled it and didn't let them get anywhere near the house. But of course, this incident frightened the family so much. I mean, children were growing up, there were girls in the house, young girls. So they decided to move to India. So they left their homeland and went to what was for them a foreign country, India, because of this religious divide which the subcontinent has been subject to since partition. And many years later, when I returned to live in Lahore, I heard from somewhere that he had died, which was a great shock for me because he was my age. And you know, when your peers die, you really get intimations of mortality. I managed somehow to get in touch with his sister who lives in Delhi and condoled with her on email. And that's the last I heard from them. There are many such stories, both sides, Pakistan and India. People being uprooted for no fault of their own because of the bigger political, maelstrom which has overtaken the subcontinent. But to return to the theme I left off with, these 1970 elections, I was saying that if you look for the thread that binds Pakistan's history together up to 1970, it revolves around two issues and they are linked. One is the issue of democracy. And of course, elections are at least the starting point, theoretically, of democracy. We had not had free and fair elections. We had either elections that were subject to all kinds of manipulation, or we had elections under military dictators. So really, the Pakistani people had not had an opportunity to exercise their franchise freely. So the 1970 elections were really the culmination of all the struggles for democracy that had gone before, since 1947. And of course, the question of democracy and the question of elections was very deeply tied with the question of the structure of the state, whether it would be federal, whether the provinces would have autonomy and how much. This too was a central issue that had dogged the heels of Pakistan from day one. I spoke earlier about one unit in West Pakistan, which was the dissolution of the existing provinces in what was then West Pakistan and subsuming them within one unit. And in a sleight of hand, the 1956 constitution gave the same number of seats in parliament to West Pakistan as East Pakistan, despite the fact that East Pakistan had more population. Less area, more population. And this too was a fundamental issue that went to the heart of how the state would be structured and whether or not democracy would be practiced. Now, for the first time in Pakistan's history, one unit was broken and the principle of one man, one vote was accepted in the 1970 elections. So it was going to be the first such exercise of free and fair expression of the will of the people. And what happened? This is very important. The provincial autonomy issue, an old issue, it's been hanging fire, it's produced so much conflict in our history East Pakistan is a very good example of that, perhaps the most prominent example of that, because the sense of deprivation in East Pakistan was enormous. There was a feeling that East Pakistan's jute exports had been used in Pakistan's history to earn foreign exchange and industrialize West Pakistan, and none of that benefit had flowed to the eastern wing. So there was that kind of extraction of resources in the form of foreign exchange, and then its transfer to the west wing, which was deeply resented by the economists and experts who studied the issue. Neglect in other ways. Although Bengali was eventually adopted as the second national language of Pakistan, but I think the degree of integration between the East Wing and the West Wing, whether because of the linguistic divide, whether because of the political divide, whether because of the sense of being treated as the poor relatives, East Pakistan, all these resentments came together in the 1970 elections. And there were two major parties in East Pakistan. One was the Awami League of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and the other one was the National Awami Party Bhashani. Now, because the Bhashani NAP decided to boycott these elections for its own reasons, quite inexplicable, that kind of left the field free for the Awami League in East Pakistan. And in the 70 elections, which are arguably the fairest and freest in our history, they won all but 2 seats in East Pakistan, which gave them a clear majority in the National Assembly. The second largest party in that assembly was going to be Bhutto's People's Party, which had won a majority in West Pakistan. Now, if the spirit and rules as framed by the Yahya regime for the 1970 elections were followed, Sheikh Mujib would be the Prime Minister. But Yahya hesitated and Bhutto jumped in and muddied the water, because he could see that if Sheikh Mujib became Prime Minister, his chances were obviously going to recede into some uncertain future. And he even came up with the idea that, somehow, which is ironic, because Sheikh Mujib's platform was the 6 points program that he gave, was essentially a confederal arrangement for the Pakistani state, so that the federating units would have much more power, financial and other. And all these complaints from the past could be addressed. Bhutto even suggested at one point a confederal arrangement, something he was opposed to earlier, because of the way the 70 elections worked out. All that was in the air. The negotiations, three-cornered, between the Yahya regime, Sheikh Mujib and Bhutto, eventually broke down without an agreement. And given the resentment which I spoke of in East Pakistan already, postponement of the National Assembly session that was due to take place, and which would have, on the basis of one man, one vote and the rules of the 70 election, would have anointed Sheikh Mujib as Prime Minister, was postponed by Yahya by about 3 weeks. Of course, there was agitation in East Pakistan as a result. Things became very tense, and on, I think, March 26th, 1971, the Yahya regime launched a military repression in East Pakistan. And it was a very bloody, virtually genocidal campaign against intellectuals, politicians, and the people of East Pakistan as a whole. Throughout that year, this went on. Millions of people fled East Pakistan, sought refuge in neighboring India to escape this. There, resistance began to be organized, what later came to be called the Mukti Bahini, guerrilla force. Obviously, India was helping that, because they were sitting on Indian soil. But then that is, unlike the conspiracy theory, a consequence of what happened rather than a conspiracy before it happened. We were, as I told you, publishing a journal in Lahore. This group, Pakistani group, would come together, students and workers, called Pakistan Zindabad, in which we were discussing the national question in Pakistan with relation to East Pakistan and Balochistan and NWFP and even Sindh. Okay, so we had been discussing it in the journal and amongst ourselves. When these events unfolded, it was the culmination of our worst nightmare, that the Pakistani state had not only failed to politically mediate these conflicts and bring the country together, which is what the 70 elections was meant to do. Instead, they have violated their own commitment, their own rules, their own law, and gone in for repression instead of handing over power to a clearly elected party. Of course, that campaign ended in a bigger tragedy because towards the end of the year, Pakistan was totally isolated internationally. We were in no position to make any case since the reports of the genocidal massacre that was taking place filtered out into the international press. Then India intervened, and by December 16th it was all over. The loss of East Pakistan, half the country, and the majority of the population, and of course there was war on the western border also, the West Pakistan border also, and there was some change of hands of territory temporarily between India and Pakistan, but relatively a stalemate on this border. Now you would have expected that with such a huge tragedy and such a cataclysmic outcome, that post 1971 fall of Dhaka, Pakistan would have been in a state of introspection, thinking about what had happened, why it had happened, in order to learn from it. Quite the opposite happened. The matter was simply brushed under the carpet. No discussion took place in the public space. There were different times, it was not so easy to have discussion in the public space. We didn't have the kind of media freedom, for example, that we have today. So it was brushed under the carpet, and the entire focus of Mr. Bhutto was then installed by the military, by another faction of the military which overthrew Yahya and installed Bhutto, first as Chief Martial Law Administrator, later President, then later Prime Minister. They were more focused then on negotiating with India, on getting whatever territory was in Indian hands back and whatever territory was in our hands given back to India, so as to get the border on the West Pakistan, what now is Pakistan, the border with India sorted out, and the 90,000 or so prisoners of war that had been taken in East Pakistan and were in Indian prisoner of war camps, how to get them back. These were the issues. So the Simla summit in 1972 wrestled with these issues, and although Bhutto won at the negotiating table the return, adjustment of territory and the return of the prisoners of war, but in return he had to concede to Indira Gandhi's insistence that the Kashmir issue would no longer be taken to the UN or international forums and would be entirely discussed bilaterally. This, from India's point of view, was the reversal of a great embarrassment that had been suffering for decades, because it is India's Nehru who took the Kashmir conflict in 1948 to the UN. But ever since then, since the UN found the only solution to this was a plebiscite, free exercise of the will of the Kashmiri people, which had never happened, partly at least because India didn't let it happen, it was an embarrassment for India wherever it went on any international forum because Pakistan was very quick to remind it. So in a sense, that albatross around their neck is what Indira Gandhi was trying to get rid of and managed in return for the concessions she made to Bhutto. This is also doubly ironic because after the 65 war, when Ayub Khan went to Tashkent to have a summit with the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Lal Bahadur Shastri, Bhutto, the foreign minister, fell out with Ayub and was sacked, and then launched a political campaign against Ayub on the lines that Ayub had agreed to some secret clauses in the Tashkent agreement, which essentially gave Kashmir away to India. And his whole political campaign from there, one central, if you like, issue or question or, claim was this. That is why I left Ayub, he said. Of course, to this day, that secret clause has never emerged. We don't know if it ever existed even. But it is the same Mr. Bhutto who in 1972 in Simla conceded at least half the the position that Pakistan had, which is not to internationalize the issue, but to discuss it bilaterally. So these are, you see, things that happen in history. It is not unknown for someone like Musharraf, the architect of Kargil, then landing up in Agra in a summit with Mr. Vajpayee and suing for peace. These things happen. Anyway, to return to what I was saying. So we in London, this group, students and workers, deeply shaken by the events back home and became doubly committed, if anything, to going back and doing something. By now we had made contact with the movement in Balochistan, which was in a state of ceasefire with the government. But the issues that had led to at least 3 wars before still simmered. Questions of provincial autonomy, questions of control over resources. Sui gas was discovered in 1952 in Sui, which is in the Bhutto area. And that gas was used all over Pakistan to industrialize, to use for commercial purposes, and even as domestic fuel. Your chulas, they burn that gas. And for years, no part of Balochistan had use of that gas, number one. It was the major source of gas at that time, perhaps something like 70% at the time. Gradually, of course, as other sources were discovered in Sindh, etc., for example, its share has declined. I think it's around 25% now, 30% perhaps. Nevertheless, a major chunk. Balochistan was deprived of that gas, and this was a reflection of the manner in which Balochistan had been treated over the years. You cannot resolve political questions by military means. You cannot, having committed yourself to the democratic expression of the people's will, then turn around and cancel it, because that will create conflict. You cannot go on denying the provinces their rights, both as federating units and as distinct cultural, linguistic, ethnic communities, and hope that the state will remain at peace. These were the lessons, broadly, that should have been learned had there been a proper discussion, but were not. And therefore, in the words of the philosopher, we had not learned from history and were condemned to repeat it. In Balochistan, in this instance. Now, it's a complex history, but very briefly. Balochistan's case, when independence was looming and the subcontinent was clearly moving towards partition, states like Balochistan were in a different category, they felt, from other areas of the subcontinent. Whereas in the whole of the subcontinent during partition, There were what were known as princely states. These were, small states headed by Maharajas or Muslim rulers or whatever. So they were dealt with differently from the rest of the subcontinent. And at the same time, Balochistan made the case that it was not even in that category of princely states, it was actually a treaty state. It had treaty status. It had treaties with the British Crown, which stemmed from the 3 wars the British fought in Balochistan in the 19th century, and then having despaired of quelling the Baloch through military means, they made treaties with them to allow the British passage to Afghanistan. So this line that you see today from Shikarpur, Jekabad through Sibi and through the Bolan Pass, Quetta to Chaman, which is the Afghan border, this was the British route, and they needed it for strategic purposes for what they were trying to achieve in Afghanistan. They were not so much interested in Balochistan per se, but they were certainly interested in a safe passage. So this treaty allowed them that. And this stretch of strategic route, as well as the Shal Valley where Quetta lies, became later redesignated as British Balochistan, where British administration held sway and British law held sway. The rest of Balochistan, under that treaty again, the tribes and the Kalat state were left intact and autonomous and not to be interfered with. And for law and order purposes, the British paid for a special force drawn from the tribes called the levies, which still exists. And they paid for that, and also, I'm told, paid off some of the tribal chieftains in order to keep the peace. So, pleading this special treaty status, the Khan of Kalat, the head of this tribal confederacy, which constituted the Kalat state that emerged in the 18th century, their argument was that because they're a treaty state, they have the right to decide what their status will be post-independence, whether an independent state or part of Pakistan, or, obviously India was not really a viable option because they were, at one end of Pakistan and India was far away, but certainly these two options were there. And 3 days before the independence of Pakistan, which was on 14th August 1947, on 11th August 1947, the two houses of the Kalat state, the upper house composed of tribal chieftains, sardars, and the lower house composed of ordinary citizens, met in joint session and passed a unanimous resolution to the effect that they would rather be independent. Now, of course, as an aspiration, there may not have been much wrong with it, but practically it was going to be very difficult to achieve, given the climate at the time where, the subcontinent was falling to 2 states, and, the aspirations of smaller states, smaller peoples, weaker peoples, didn't really receive the kind of fair treatment that perhaps it deserved. Balochistan is part of that. Okay, so what happens is that negotiations are going on between Mr. Jinnah and the Khan of Kalat about the status of Balochistan post-independence, and then losing patience because the Kashmir war blew up early 48. The Khan of Kalat in his autobiography records that he was coerced into signing an accession document. Now that created a conflict in that part of Pakistan which continues to this day. The annexation was not accepted because Khan in any case had no mandate from the two houses of Kalat state to do this. He was coerced, he says in his book. So the mandate was questionable and the accession was questionable. And sure enough, his younger brother is the first one to rebel against this and go up into the mountains in true Baloch resistance style to wage guerrilla warfare. You can't drive people into paradise at the point of a bayonet, even if it is paradise. And arguably, in the circumstances obtaining at independence and partition, more patience perhaps and more diplomacy and a better negotiating strategy might have served both the Baloch and Pakistan better by, in a sense, cutting short the process and coercing the Khan. The seeds of what has now become almost a perpetual conflict were laid. And we are still suffering from it to this day. Now, the first rebellion I mentioned, Agha Abdul Karim Khan, the Khan of Kalat's younger brother, who went up into the Sarawak mountains on the Baloch-Afghan border and waged a struggle from there. And then that was resolved, if you can call it resolved, by what later became a chain of broken promises. Agha Abdul Karim and his companions were called down on oath on the Quran to negotiate, and as soon as they arrived, they were arrested. He spent the next 16 years out of 22 in jail. That doesn't endear anyone to, the state. In a similar instance, when Ayub Khan carried out his military coup in 58, as part of the justification for the coup, the first act was to arrest the Khan of Kalat and accuse him of fomenting a rebellion against Pakistan. Although I think a milder person than that Khan of Kalat it would be difficult to find. And so the whole charge seems rather trumped up. But became a self-fulfilling prophecy as far as Balochistan is concerned because of the arrest of the Khan. I remember as a child, we were living in Gulberg, cycling around, and in P Block Gulberg, there was a house on the corner with a flag on it. So we were very curious, what is this? And gradually we discovered that there was a political prisoner under house arrest in this house. And who was the political prisoner? We were later to discover it was the Khan of Kalat, who had been transported there and kept under house arrest.
So did you ever see him?
No, we were not allowed in. I mean, there was a big security guard around it. And, ordinary people weren't allowed in. So this is a fragment from my childhood that I remember. And naturally, these events led to another rebellion in Balochistan. In the central mountain massif of Balochistan lie, some very forbidding mountains, forbidding terrain. And the rebellion there sputtered on until, again on oath on the Quran, the guerrillas were called down for negotiations and then arrested. So, if you can think of a parallel, it is probably the Indian wars in the United States of America and how they quelled the tribes, the indigenous peoples. Broken promises. Now, further to that incident, Nawroz Khan, who was the leader of that struggle, a 90-year-old tribal chieftain, he and 9 of his sons and nephews were jailed, and he was spared because of his old age, but the others were hanged. He died of old age in prison. That, again, doesn't endear anyone to the state of Pakistan, this kind of thing. So, you've got bitterness and alienation to begin with. And then you are adding to that by these kinds of actions and a repressive policy, which the Baloch then see increasingly as an internal colonialism. So the resentment and the resistance against that, and in a traditional Baloch tribal manner, armed resistance. This has been the pattern off and on in Balochistan since 1947. And there's an insurgency going on even today. So you can see that the problem has festered and remained unresolved to date. I think there are always means to negotiate, even in the most intractable conflicts. Of course, the more intractable they are, the more difficult the process is. But to rule it out altogether, I think, is not logical. Circumstances change, the dynamic of the situation changes, states change their policies. These things are not beyond the realm of possibility. Let me say that first, in principle. In the concrete circumstances that obtained in Balochistan, in the relationship between the state and Balochistan, I think there were some demands that perhaps the state had gone too far down the road and was unable to reverse. For instance, the question of annexation and Balochistan being part of Pakistan. Perhaps they were not willing to concede. I know they were not willing to concede that. But there was a lot of space in between the extreme demand for separation and the other pole which said no question. I think Mr. Bhutto had a golden opportunity or chance to tackle this problem in a meaningful and long-term way. But unfortunately, I think he deliberately mucked that up. What do I mean? Mr. Bhutto's challenge when he took over at the end of 1971, after the fall of Dhaka, was to hold Pakistan together, what was left of Pakistan. After all, a major chunk had broken away, more than half the population, not half the territory, but certainly more than half the population. And you can imagine the demoralization, the sense of questioning. This was, after all, Mr. Jinnah's Pakistan, whose demise now was evident. So what was going to replace it? Could it replace it? And what would be the shape of that replacement? That Bhutto attempted to sum up in the slogan, Naya Pakistan. You're hearing it today from Imran Khan, but he's not the original author of this slogan. It's Bhutto, Naya Pakistan. We'll make a new Pakistan, he said.
What was that Pakistan?
Bring the pieces together. Heal the wounds. Come to a collective compact. What this country is going to be and how it's going to go forward. Now, what happened on all these issues? I told you that he was in complex negotiations with India, which finally ended with the Simla Accord of 1972. He was also anxious, in a sense, to legitimize his own ascent to power, which was based on the results of the 1970 elections in West Pakistan. The elections were part of a united Pakistan, but the results were being used, despite East Pakistan's breaking away, the results in West Pakistan were being used to now fashion the post-breakaway regime. Now, Mr. Bhutto was being given the mantle of having the maximum number of seats. If his mandate was to be recognized, in all fairness, the mandate of all other parties must also be recognized. Only then could the legitimacy of this arrangement be, validated. So he negotiated with the opposition parties. Who were they? The National Awami Party, Wali Khan, and the Jamiyat-e-Ulama Islam, which at that time was led by Fazlur Rahman's father, Mufti Mahmud. And Wali Khan, the son of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Bacha Khan, head of his party. They had won a majority of the provincial seats in NWFP and Balochistan as an alliance. And so when he negotiated with them, the agreement they arrived at was an interim constitution that was promulgated, if I'm not mistaken, in April 1972. Under that, Mr. Bhutto's status was changed from civilian chief martial law administrator, which that junta that installed him in power had, designated him as, to President of Pakistan. And they agreed that these two parties would have their own governors in NWFP and Balochistan. Why is this significant? Because traditionally, and even now in our 73 constitution, the governor of a province is the representative of the federation of the president. Okay? So Bhutto could have had his own governors. Instead, in this process of negotiations and trying to bring all these disparate, broken pieces together, Mr. Bhutto made this concession. Not only this, since NAP-JUI, the alliance, had a majority of seats in these two provinces, he allowed them to form the governments there. After all, he was forming the government at the centre, forming the government in Punjab and Sindh. So if that was legitimate, in order to validate its legitimacy, the other had to be legitimate too. This was what I was trying to explain. This was the negotiation and the strategy that Mr. Bhutto adopted to first bring the political fragments together before the state could then begin to be rebuilt, as it were, from the debris of Jinnah's Pakistan. Even in April 1972, when this interim constitution was promulgated and these governments led by NAP-JUI were installed in NWFP in Balochistan, there were divisions within NAP itself. The quantum of provincial autonomy that the provisional constitution gave and the mistrust between parts of the NAP leadership and Mr. Bhutto, all these were factors in all the reservations which didn't come out into the public space but were known to informed observers. Now, instead of now building on this compact and keeping the opposition on board in order to get a consensual 73 constitution in which all four federating units would be partners, the compact would cut across ethnic, class, political, linguistic, cultural, provincial lines and be the foundation for a state that could then survive and go forward. Instead of following the logic of what he initially did in 1972 by negotiating and, on a give and take basis, settling the issue, Mr. Bhutto in his wisdom decided that the government in Balochistan, led by Sardar Ataullah Mengal, was not to be trusted. Part of the reason for his coming to this conclusion was an internal rift in the NAP ranks, NAP leadership ranks. Akbar Bugti, who was killed in 2006 by Musharraf, chief of the Bugti tribe, wanted NAP to make him governor of Balochistan since they had the choice. They didn't trust him entirely, so they declined. So he fell out with them. And when he fell out with them, he went and transmitted to Mr. Bhutto all kinds of tall tales about this guerrilla army that exists in Balochistan and how it is just waiting in the wings for, a chance or an opportunity, and, it'll come pouring down from the mountains and take over Balochistan. Scary stories. The truth of the matter was that when the Yahya regime and its governor in West Pakistan, Air Marshal Noor Khan, negotiated a ceasefire with the anti-Ayyub resistance in Balochistan, the terms of that were that the areas in which the guerrillas were operating would be left alone, autonomous. The tribes would be autonomous. None of the guerrillas would have their arms taken away from them. In tribal culture, your weapon is your life. Okay? So the arms won't be taken away. They can keep their arms as long as they don't fight. Ceasefire, kind of a standstill. And then, of course, turning the conflict into what was then thought was the better option of elections in 1970. So the guerrillas still existed in the mountains. But the manner in which they were presented to Mr. Bhutto as a threat was exaggerated beyond any facts. Mr. Bhutto partly, I think, panicked, and partly, I think, in any case, by temperament. He may have been forced to make the concessions he did in 1972 early because there was no choice. But I don't think temperamentally that is what he wanted. He wanted to control all of Pakistan. So in the 10 months that the Sardar Ataullah-led NAP-JUI government in Balochistan existed, under that interim 72 constitution, there were constant provocations. Police strikes, unheard of in the history of Pakistan. Instigating rival tribal chieftains to create trouble. And things like that. Confrontations by federal forces with local, tribals who are armed. Lots of these instances. And so by the beginning of 1973, things were coming to a head. And on February 15th, 1973, Mr. Bhutto dismissed the Sardar Ataullah government. Now, almost inevitably, the Baloch tribes once again went into resistance mode, meaning they went up into the mountains with their arms and started fighting. That is the 70s resistance or insurgency with which we were involved. So I'm, coming to our part in that. I told you that we had made contact in 1970 with the Baloch movement.
But tell us more about this London group. Who were the members? What was your place in it? And your brother was also involved with you. Tell us more about him.
My brother accompanied me to study in England in 1969. When I came home on holiday and then he went back with me, he went to study architecture. And he was not political at the time. He lived with me, obviously, and in my flat was where the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign meetings were being held in 1968 before he arrived. And by the time he arrived, the Pakistani group, going on, books, literature, ideas floating around in the air. It would take a particularly dense human being not to be affected or infected, if you like. So he was drawn in. The group consisted of chapters in London, in Cambridge, in Oxford, at the universities, in Birmingham, amongst the working class, Pakistani working class, amongst the London working class, and then scattered small grouplets elsewhere. Now, what was this group attempting to do? What was it discussing before the Baloch connection? Essentially, we were of the view that the crisis of the state is coming to a head. This is before 71. I'm talking about 69, 70. But it was obviously coming to a head. The election may have accelerated it, and the not accepting the results of the election, of course, brought it on. But we were anticipating some of these crises on the basis of our study of Pakistan's history and, circumstances, facts on the ground. The national question, therefore, did loom large already. It was a question of discovering it, recognizing it, understanding it, which we attempted to do. Initially, our project was simply to return, because we were not convinced that there was any party in Pakistan, definitely not on the left, where we could find a comfortable niche, i.e. there would be, a meeting of minds, hum-ahangi of ideas, and, the ability to work together towards a common goal. We were not convinced. We studied all the parties, even met some of them. Not convinced, not persuaded. So we decided that the best thing would be to first go home and travel on foot the length and breadth of the country to learn about it, because most of us had been away for years. And even when we had come away, we didn't know the country as well as we wanted to. So the program was, we're going to traverse the length and breadth of the country, get to know what are the conditions, and then make up our mind how to go about bringing about a change. This is where we were as a group when we were contacted.
What age group were all of you that time, so young and ambitious?
I was 20, 21. Most of them were my age, some were even younger. So young people. And it may interest you to know that there were women in that group too. We were not yet, I think, fully cognizant of the kind of gender equality that we promote today. Ideas have moved forward. But even at that initial stage, the idea of women having an equal role and the same respect, I think that was in us. We may not always have been able to practice it, but at least in principle it was there. So you can see that this was a very loose kind of plan, and to fulfill it, most of us were doing odd jobs. Now, I had given up accountancy. Were doing odd jobs. I and a couple of friends, for example, were painting houses to make some money, put it away, and then have it transmitted to Pakistan every month to survive on and do our tour of the country. And do you know how much was going to be coming to us monthly? £2 a month. £2 sterling a month at that time meant 60 rupees. The rupee was at 30 a pound. I'm talking about 71, okay? 71. 70. The reasoning being, full-time Communist Party cadres were given 60 rupees a month to survive on in those days. So we pegged ourselves to that standard. So we were putting money away by doing odd jobs, and banks were being instructed, okay, we'll get to Pakistan and we'll send you an account or something, and then you transfer £2 a month into that account for us to survive on. You can call it quixotic, idealistic, whatever, but that's where we were. It's at that moment, virtually on the eve, I think, of the beginning of our departure, that we came in contact with the Baloch movement. And after lengthy discussions, we came to the conclusion that yes, this fitted in with what we had been thinking about vis-a-vis the federal structure, the national question, provincial autonomy, the history of conflict. East Pakistan now, increasingly being a factor in our thinking. This is 70 elections had taken place.